Aerolith stepped off the shuttle and immediately wished she had packed more than 3 pairs of human shoes, none of which were actually designed for walking on uneven sidewalks. Her long ears twitched in irritation, not from the breeze, though it was chillier than expected, but from the constant buzz of her internal sensors trying to reconcile human physiology with their strange gravitational quirks. She had been briefed, Earth is quaint, chaotic, and emotionally erratic. Humans were laughably fragile, yet somehow their planet persisted. It was supposed to be easy. Infiltrate, observe, marry, report, done. But the moment she stepped onto the bustling street, dodging a bicycle that seemed to have a vendetta against pedestrians, she realized humans were as unpredictable as her grandmother's pet quarg, only slightly less lethal. The first obstacle appeared almost immediately, a small device humans called a coffee cart that emitted what smelled like molten happiness. Daniel, her soon-to-be husband by arrangement and the key to her mission, was standing there with an expression of confusion that could be patented. He was wearing a sweater that had somehow acquired 3 permanent stains and socks that clashed in ways that would have horrified any self-respecting Galithian. Aerolith's ears twitched in both amusement and mild disgust. "Do you require assistance with this caffeine acquisition?" she asked in her carefully neutral tone, forgetting that humans often found anything phrased in stilted politeness unnervingly funny. Daniel looked up, blinked, and then tried to answer while simultaneously juggling his wallet, a laptop bag, and an enthusiastic corgi. He dropped the wallet, the corgi yipped, the coffee spilled, and Aerolith, who had spent her entire life perfecting composure, had to step aside to avoid being splashed. Thanks," he managed. His voice wavered in a way that made her sensors tick with curiosity. Something about his disorganized courage was oddly appealing. The shuttle had delivered her under the guise of a research grant, a perfect cover for spending months embedded in human society. Her mission was simple: secure Daniel's compliance, monitor him, learn their weaknesses. She had expected humorless bureaucrats and timid scholars. Instead, she got an open-hearted, fumbling, slightly bewildered man whose main concerns seemed to be whether the toaster burned the bread and whether his neighbor's cat was judging him. Aerolith decided to proceed with caution, noting that humans' priorities were peculiar. Over the next week, she studied him in what could only be called covert domestic observation. Daniel's apartment was a shrine to chaos, a mountain of takeout containers beside a bookshelf that displayed everything from philosophical treatises to board games missing half their pieces. Aerolith attempted to sort his recycling, an endeavor that resulted in a minor explosion when a soda can reacted unpredictably with the leftover hummus. Daniel stared, slack-jawed, and then burst out laughing, a sound so full of absurd joy it triggered something unexpected in her. She suppressed a small gasp. No Galithian had ever laughed at a chemical mishap. Meals together were a test of human absurdity. Daniel insisted that pizza required a precise layering of pepperoni that could only be described as ceremonial. Aerolith attempted to adapt her metabolism to Earth food protocols, but misjudged the spice levels of a jalapeno, resulting in an impromptu fire alarm demonstration and an involuntary dance of her long ears. Daniel clapped at her performance, clearly unaware that the twitching appendages were a sign of distress in her species. Aerolith filed the incident as quaint human misperception of alien physiology, while secretly noting that these small, chaotic moments were oddly enjoyable. At night, when Daniel talked about the universe, about constellations, about how gravity felt like a gentle hug on his best days, Aerolith began to notice something she had not anticipated. Humans were fragile, yes, but their minds contained a kind of elastic stubbornness, a loyalty and curiosity that stretched in directions no fleet of Galithian ships could predict. She had come expecting weakness. Instead, she found a chaotic resilience that intrigued her, made her ears flick in involuntary excitement, and occasionally left her silently questioning centuries of imperial doctrine. By the end of the week, the first steps of the marriage plan were in place. She had convinced Daniel that their union was an administrative formality for some obscure anthropology program, which he accepted with the kind of cheerful oblivion that made her wonder how humans survived anything at all. She had signed the papers in the courthouse, where a clerk asked with shocking indifference whether she preferred vanilla or chocolate frosting on the celebratory cookies. Aerolith had chosen vanilla, though she could not taste it, and Daniel had cheered as if they had just saved the planet. Alone that evening, Aerolith stared out at the city skyline, her reflection flickering on the glass like a holographic ghost. She had completed the first stage of her mission. The war had not started. The council would be pleased. And yet she found herself thinking of Daniel, of his laugh, his stubbornness, the way he argued with a vending machine over its refusal to give him a snack. Humans were unpredictable, yes, but there was something in that unpredictability that made her long ears twitch in a way she had not experienced since childhood, long before the weight of imperial duty had been pressed onto her shoulders. Somewhere between the spilled coffee, the humming toaster, and Daniel's earnest attempts at showing her the best taco truck in town, Aerolith began to suspect that the humans she had come to control might, in fact, be the ones controlling her. And as the night deepened, she allowed herself a small, quiet smile, realizing that perhaps the galaxy was more complicated and more amusing than she had ever been told. Aerolith had been living with Daniel for 3 months, and in that time she had learned to navigate a world far stranger than any Galithian war simulation. His apartment was now a jungle of tangled wires, half-assembled gadgets, and the occasional exotic plant that seemed to have survived by sheer force of will, much like the humans themselves. Daniel moved through it all with an air of cheerful chaos, leaving a trail of mismatched socks and spilled coffee in his wake. Aerolith, who had anticipated meticulous control and predictable schedules, found herself increasingly bewildered by the absurd rhythm of human life. The very air seemed to vibrate with randomness, and she had come to suspect that some invisible law of Earth physics encouraged minor disasters just to amuse its inhabitants. Their mornings were particularly challenging. Daniel insisted on scientific breakfast experiments, which usually involved testing combinations of cereal, fruit, and various liquids to determine which produced the best crunch-to-sog ratio. Aerolith, following protocol, documented each experiment with meticulous precision, though she found herself laughing when Daniel accidentally created a foamy eruption that coated the ceiling and a portion of her long ears. "I call it a cereal volcano," he announced proudly. Aerolith's ears twitched involuntarily. She noted this as a human response she did not fully understand, joy derived from minor chaos. Despite the chaos, Aerolith began to observe patterns that were invisible to her sensors. Daniel displayed loyalty that defied all Galithian logic. He rescued stray animals that were obviously diseased, stood up to coworkers who treated him unfairly, and spent entire evenings arguing with a malfunctioning robot vacuum that refused to clean under the couch. Each act was irrational from a tactical standpoint, yet she noticed how these acts bonded him to others, building invisible networks of trust and mutual aid. She realized that human strength lay not in their technology or their fleets. They had none, but in the unpredictably powerful bonds that tied them together. One evening, Daniel decided that their living room needed more atmospheric lighting, which involved stringing multicolored bulbs across the ceiling in patterns that defied Euclidean geometry. Aerolith tried to assist, only to become entangled in the cords, spinning helplessly in midair. Daniel laughed so hard he fell into a chair, wiping tears from his eyes. Aerolith, dangling upside down, felt something unfamiliar: amusement. It was sharp, unpredictable, and slightly alarming, but it also had a warming effect, a strange gravity that pulled her toward him even as her Galithian instincts warned her to maintain distance. Humor became a tool she had not anticipated. Daniel's jokes, awkward, self-deprecating, and occasionally absurd, created openings in his behavior that allowed her to study him more closely. She noted how he could endure minor inconveniences with remarkable resilience. Burnt toast, a clogged shower drain, or an alien accidentally turning his living room into a laboratory. She began to appreciate that the human capacity for patience, combined with a willingness to forgive, was a weapon in its own right, an emotional force that could bend circumstances without firing a single laser. Their relationship, initially a matter of political strategy, evolved in unexpected ways. Daniel invited her to meet his friends, who treated her like an eccentric cousin from a distant galaxy. They introduced her to Earth customs with unabashed enthusiasm. Karaoke that involved tone-deaf singing, board games that ended in laughter and minor destruction of furniture, and competitive eating contests, where the prize was a homemade trophy shaped like a taco. Aerolith, despite her mission, found herself enjoying these moments, especially when Daniel tried to explain the rules with all the seriousness of a starship captain briefing a fleet. One night during a minor blackout caused by a sudden storm, Daniel insisted on candlelight and an improvised picnic in the living room. Aerolith, sitting cross-legged on a blanket, watched as he fumbled with sandwiches and accidentally spilled juice onto the floor. Rather than scolding him, she found herself laughing, and he responded by deliberately knocking over a candle to make her squeal. It was absurd, illogical, and utterly human. In those moments, she began to understand that human ingenuity often relied not on precision, but on improvisation, humor, and emotional connection. Her reports to the council became increasingly complicated. Aerolith was supposed to catalog weaknesses and document opportunities for control, yet the more time she spent observing Daniel, the more she found herself questioning the assumptions of the Empire. Humans were not weak. They were unpredictable, adaptable, and fiercely loyal in ways that no Galithian tactical model could predict. She recorded these observations with a mixture of professional rigor and private awe, annotating margins with sketches of Daniel's antics, his triumphant dance when he successfully unclogged a drain, or the triumphant smile he wore when he convinced a neighbor to help return a lost dog. One morning, Aerolith woke to find Daniel attempting to teach a flock of pigeons how to perform coordinated aerobatics in the park. She raised an eyebrow, ear twitching in disbelief, yet she could not stop herself from laughing as he gestured wildly, giving elaborate instructions to birds that clearly ignored him. It struck her that humans, for all their apparent fragility, possessed a stubborn determination to impose meaning on chaos. And in that stubbornness, Aerolith saw the kernel of a power far greater than the most advanced Galithian technology. By the end of the chapter, Aerolith had begun to accept that her mission might not proceed as planned. She had come expecting compliance, submission, and predictability. Instead, she found herself living amidst a chaotic brilliance, a humor-infused resilience that constantly defied her expectations. Humans were not easily controlled, and Daniel, in his bumbling yet unwavering way, had become the prism through which she saw the astonishing, untamable force of humanity. Her long ears twitched in contemplation, a mixture of irritation and reluctant admiration. Somehow, in the midst of spilled coffee, misbehaving pigeons, and improvised candlelight picnics, Aerolith was beginning to understand why no empire ever truly dared to underestimate humans. Aerolith's communicator buzzed insistently, the hollow screen flickering to life with the grim faces of the Galithian Council. "Princess Aerolith," intoned the lead envoy, voice sharper than a photon blade, "we have received alarming reports. Your mission is in jeopardy. Humans exhibit capabilities far beyond our projections. Explain your findings immediately." She stared at the floating images, long ears twitching, then sighed, explaining Daniel, his crooked grin, and the way he somehow rallied neighbors to fix a collapsed water main would sound absurd. Yet that absurdity was the truth, and truth had a way of refusing containment. Meanwhile, Daniel burst into the apartment, juggling 2 grocery bags, a bicycle helmet, and a small, defiant raccoon he had rescued from the park. "Look what I found," he declared, as if presenting a priceless artifact. Aerolith pinched the bridge of her nose. Her carefully structured mission had already turned into chaos, and now he had added wildlife diplomacy to the mix. "Daniel," she began, trying to retain authority, "we are in the middle of—" but stopped as the raccoon promptly climbed her shoulder and snatched her comm badge. She froze. Daniel laughed. "He likes you. I think you passed the first test of acceptance." Aerolith's ears twitched involuntarily, a mixture of exasperation and amusement. Reports arrived of humans refusing bribes, defending one another against overwhelming odds, and improvising solutions with a creativity that bordered on madness. A neighboring city had rerouted an entire energy grid after a minor quake using nothing more than bicycles, cargo nets, and sheer communal will. The Galithian Council calculated the odds, recalculated, and then recalculated again, all the while muttering about inferior species showing disconcerting resilience. Aerolith listened in fascination. The humans were terrifying not in firepower but in unpredictability, loyalty, and emotional ferocity. The council demanded a strategy, force compliance or retreat. Aerolith hesitated. Reporting Daniel as weak would betray the truth. Reporting him as strong would brand him, and all humans as a threat. She glanced at him, attempting to teach the raccoon to do a high five, utterly oblivious to the political storm. She realized then that her heart, long trained to measure allegiance and efficiency, had shifted. Daniel's humor, his loyalty to absurd causes, and the simple courage of his daily life had rewritten her understanding of power. Humans were not easy to control, nor weak. They were unpredictable forces that could not be ignored. Aerolith called a council meeting, appearing with ears neatly pinned back and a calm, deceptive demeanor. "The humans must not be underestimated," she said, each word carefully chosen. "Their strength is not in weapons nor in fleets, but in their capacity to bond, to adapt, and to act with a stubborn, unquantifiable resolve. Any attempt at conquest will fail, not because they are weak, but because they are human." The envoys' faces shifted between shock, disbelief, and outrage. One member sputtered, "You propose mercy." Aerolith's lips quirked. "No. I propose caution and an observation period. I have learned something our simulations could never teach us. Humans fight best when fighting seems impossible, and they laugh while doing it." Daniel, oblivious to the political theater, arrived moments later carrying a makeshift catapult he had invented to launch marshmallows at the ceiling for the raccoon. Aerolith caught his eye, and in that moment, all the protocols, warnings, and imperial strategies felt absurd. Her empire had prepared for wars of destruction, yet here was a species that had survived, thrived, and charmed its way into her perspective with nothing more than tenacity and humor. She realized that she no longer measured the universe in terms of fleets and power grids. She measured it in laughter, courage, and the invisible threads that connected one life to another. The council reluctantly agreed to her recommendation. Plans for invasion were quietly shelved, and Aerolith returned to Earth with a newfound sense of purpose. She had come as a spy, a diplomat, a manipulator, yet she remained, unexpectedly, irrevocably, changed. Humanity had taught her that strength did not always roar. Sometimes it grinned, joked, or refused to surrender a parking spot to a stranger, and in those moments it was unconquerable. At home, Daniel dropped onto the couch with a triumphant grin, a raccoon perched on his shoulder, 2 mugs of steaming cocoa in hand. "So, what did the Galactic Council say about your field research?" he asked. Aerolith blinked, ears flicking, then allowed herself a small, genuine laugh. "They will adjust their projections," she said carefully. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Adjusted projections sounds official." She shook her head, amused, and poured the cocoa. The raccoon attempted to steal a marshmallow. They sat together, an alien princess and a human man, in a city that pulsed with chaos and possibility. Aerolith had entered their world believing she could manipulate it, believing humans were fragile and predictable. She now understood that the unpredictable bonds of love, loyalty, humor, and resilience could outmatch fleets and weapons. In the quiet warmth of their shared apartment, amid spilled cocoa and a stubborn raccoon, she realized she had discovered a power far greater than anything the Empire could offer. The unpredictable, irrepressible force of the human heart. And somewhere between Daniel's laughter, the raccoon's antics, and the softly glowing city outside the window, Aerolith's long ears twitched in contentment. She had begun the mission to control humanity, but she had ended it by joining them. She had changed, irrevocably, completely. And she knew that whatever the galaxy held, she would face it not as a strategist, but as someone who understood that real strength often hides in the most chaotic human moments.